Alright, so I'm going to start this off with a little bit of context. Usually when I'm filming stuff, I will either do it on a tripod or handheld. Sometimes I will use a gimbal, but not that often. And whenever I'm using a tripod to film most of the stuff that I need to film, the weight of the camera that I'm using doesn't necessarily matter that much because I'm just going to set it up on the tripod, point it at whatever it needs to be pointing at, and do it that way. And I'm only going to pick it up if I need to move it between different setups. However, when I'm going to be filming handheld, the weight of the camera can be a little bit more of an issue because the heavier the camera setup is, the quicker my arms are going to get tired and the shakier the handheld footage is going to be. So I've been seeing videos from a bunch of different people talking about this one specific filmmaking accessory that a lot of people seem to swear by called a camera saddle. Now, a camera saddle is essentially this duffel bag looking thing that you're supposed to swing over your shoulder and then you can rest your camera on it, and it helps to transfer some of the weight of the camera that you're shooting with away from just your arms and onto more of your body. And it's basically supposed to make it a little bit easier to carry heavier camera setups, and as a result of that, it can also help you get slightly more stable handheld footage while still letting you keep the handheld look. And I've always been interested in those, but I've never gotten one for one specific reason, which is that they seem way too expensive for what they are, which is basically just like these pillow bag looking things that are filled with garbage. And the reason I say garbage is because from what I've seen, most of them are either filled with a bunch of styrofoam pellets or some sort of like other shredded foam. And I know a few different brands make camera saddles, but they basically all look like the exact same thing. From what I know, the cheapest one is around $160, which in my opinion is still too much for what is essentially a pillow filled with garbage. And just to be clear, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm completely wrong, and maybe it's one of those things that you buy once in your lifetime and then you use it forever, in which case $160 is definitely not that much for basically a lifetime investment. But I just have the feeling that they cost as much as they do because of the cinema tax, which is basically when something is being marketed towards professional filmmakers and like videographers, and just purely because of that, it costs a lot more money than it should for what it is. So a while back, YouTube recommended me this video of a guy who made his own camera saddle by using a laundry bag that had a shoulder strap, and then he put a pillow inside of it. And it seemed like it worked really well, but it got me thinking, and I started talking to some of my filmmaker Discord friends about other ways to DIY a camera saddle that might be a little bit better than what I saw in that video. So after going down a rabbit hole, or actually a few different rabbit holes, I ended up making my own DIY camera saddle. And this is what I was able to come up with. So I made this on a really tight budget, and when you add everything up, I think the materials for this cost me around like 30 bucks. And I'm gonna be totally honest, for how cheap this is and for how simple it was to put together, this thing fucking slaps. I actually already brought this on a small project that I did with a friend a couple of days ago, and it was super useful, and I definitely see myself using it a lot more. Plus, I'm really happy with this because I think that I was able to combine some very useful features into it. So I'm just gonna set this down so that I don't have to hold it throughout the entire video, and I'll tell you all about it, but I will show you some B-roll of how it works and how it looks and all of that sort of stuff. So when it comes to the requirements that I had for building something like this, there were a few things that I really wanted to focus on. First of all, I didn't want to have just like a generic cheap laundry bag, and instead I wanted to have either a messenger bag or a duffel bag or something that was at least a little bit more durable. And I'm gonna be totally honest, the messenger bag that I got isn't the best thing in the world. Like, it doesn't feel the highest quality, but I definitely think that it is at least slightly more durable than just like a thin laundry bag. And I'm just gonna try my best to not ruin it immediately. I also definitely wanted to have pockets for accessories because from what I know, the more expensive camera saddles do have pockets, but I just wanted to have a little bit more control over how big the pockets were and where exactly they were on the bag. So the bag that I got has 4 pockets with drawstrings that I can close up. So it basically lets me drop in any empty batteries or cleaning supplies dyes or filters or any other accessories that I don't need to be using at any given time, instead of having to stuff them in the pockets of my pants or my jackets or whatever. I also wanted to be able to control how firm or how soft it is, which is something that I'll talk about in a second. I also wanted it to be easy to clean and maintain if I have to. So that means that if this messenger bag gets dirty, I can just throw it in the washing machine, give it a good wash, and then continue using it. Something else that was also kind of important to me was that I wanted to leave myself some room to improve this in the future, because this is just my first try. It's kind of like a prototype, and I already know some things that I want to improve on it in the future. All right, so I also want to talk about some of the supplies that I got to build this thing. First up, I started with an inexpensive messenger bag, and I thought that it would be a little bit bigger in terms of dimensions, but that's not really the biggest problem. It's also supposed to be water resistant, but I haven't tested that out, and honestly, I would prefer not to test it out. So I'm just going to try my best to keep this bag out of any sort of rain whenever possible. I also got 2 small laundry bags, which are also supposed to be water resistant, but again, I'm going to try my best not to test that out unless I really have to. And I actually got those as kind of a second layer of protection for the filling of the bag. Speaking of the filling, what I got are basically these styrofoam pellets, which are usually meant as beanbag filler. And I actually feel like beanbag filling was the right move here compared to something like a pillow, because it's going to adjust to the shape and the weight of whatever camera you have on there a lot better. And the thing is, after I filled one of the laundry bags with all of the beanbag pellets, I had a lot of them left over. So I went ahead and I just filled the other laundry bag with them as well. So now I can essentially use that as kind of a hi-hat, which is basically just like a really, really low to the ground tripod. But that is going to be a lot easier to use than a tripod, because you can just set it on the ground, position your camera however you need to position it for a low angle shot, and then when you're done, you just pick it up and you carry it away. You don't have to mess around with tripod legs or a tripod head or whatever. So that was a little bit of a bonus that I didn't expect, but it's something that I am kind of glad happened. And also an added benefit of the fact that I have this laundry bag filled with the styrofoam pellets is that I can just take it out of the messenger bag that I have right now if I need to, and I can either use it on its own or I can transfer it into a different bag if I ever need to do that. I also ended up getting a few extra buckles that I might put on the strap of the messenger bag just to like make it quick release, which might be a pretty good addition to it, but we'll see if I end up doing that. And then finally, I also had this shoulder pad that was left over from another camera bag that I don't use much, so I decided to repurpose that for the camera saddle. So now I want to talk about why I actually like this thing so much, to the point where I would probably call it one of my new favorite filmmaking tools. And it's essentially because there are just so many different ways to use it. It is really light, which means that I can put it over either one of my shoulders, and I can just swing it over to the front of my body whenever I need to put a camera on it. But then when I don't need to use it, I can just swing it over to my back. And because of how light and easy it is to carry, it doesn't get in the way. Something else that I really like about it is that I can use it with both a really light camera setup, but also a heavier one. So earlier when I mentioned that I brought it on a project, the way that I used it for that was just to support my camera with a lens on it, and that's it. But if I need to, I can also rig out my FX30 with some handles, a monitor, some batteries, and other accessories, and it can support all of that just fine as well. And it makes it much easier to hold. But regardless of how heavy the setup is that I'm using, it pretty much always helps with handheld footage. And it's especially noticeable whenever I'm trying to do any sort of camera movements at longer focal lengths. So for example, if I am shooting at something like 50mm or 70mm, I can definitely focus and try to keep my camera stable and get some usable footage. But it just feels much easier whenever I'm using my DIY camera saddle. Plus, whenever I'm not actually filming anything, I can just rest the camera on it and support it a little bit with my arms instead of having to constantly be holding it and getting tired, or setting it somewhere on a table and worrying about whether or not it's gonna like fall over or if somebody's gonna bump into it. But beyond just using it for a camera setup, I can also actually use it whenever I'm shooting with a gimbal, because I can just put my camera on the gimbal and then rest the gimbal itself onto the bag, and it's going to make it a lot easier to hold it because it's going to transfer a lot of the weight away from just my arms and onto more of my body, and that can also help to make some of the gimbal moves that I need to do a little bit smoother. So while I was planning for this video, I wrote down some notes with some reasons why I think that my DIY version of a camera saddle might be a little bit better than some of the more expensive ones. For starters, like I said, it is going to be much cheaper. Like I already mentioned, this cost me around like 30 bucks in materials. Also, something that I briefly mentioned earlier is that it is going to be a lot easier to maintain and repair if I need to, because if it rips for whatever reason, I can just try to sew up the hole and keep using it. Or worst case, if it gets totally destroyed, as long as the inside bag that is protecting the filling is fine, I can take it out and put it into a different bag and just recycle the old one. Now, obviously, like I said, I'm going to try my best to keep this in one piece for as long as possible, and I'm going to try not to destroy it immediately whenever I use it on like my next project. But it just feels good to know that it is going to be much cheaper and easier to maintain compared to one of the more expensive ones, because if one of those gets damaged, I think that you would pretty much have to just throw it away and buy another one, which ends up getting a lot more expensive, and it feels a lot more wasteful. Also, something else that I think is kind of important is the fact that I have a lot more control over how the DIY version looks in terms of the dimensions of it, in terms of where it has pockets, how big those pockets are, and stuff like that, which you don't really have that much control over if you're going with one of the more expensive options, because they're pretty much all built the same way, at least in terms of the dimensions and the positioning of pockets. Also, something else I talked about is the fact that I have more control over how firm or how soft it is, which is cool because I can take out some of the beanbag filler if I want to make it softer, or I can put more of it in if I want to make it firmer, depending on what sort of camera package I'm going to be using with it. Also, depending on what bag you go with for something like this, you can make it look a little bit more stealthy compared to the more professional options. And possibly one of my favorite things about the DIY approach to this is the fact that it lets me test out this style of accessory without having to drop a bunch of money on something that I could have potentially not liked at all. And again, there is definitely a lot of room to improve it down the line by making it with like a higher quality bag and stuff like that. But even though I'm really happy with my first attempt at something like this, it is definitely not perfect. So I wanted to try and be objective, and I wrote down some reasons why the more expensive purpose-built ones might actually be better. First of all of them seem like they're built with tougher materials, which probably means that they're going to be more durable, and that probably means that you're going to have to replace them a lot less often, if at all, which I'm pretty sure is not the case with the DIY one that I made. But again, if you do end up having to replace them, it is also going to be more expensive. But the fact that they're built with better materials probably means that you're going to have to baby them a lot less if you're going to be shooting in like rougher environments. So that might be a little bit of a peace of mind kind of thing for some people. Also, the dimensions and the shape of the purpose-built ones are probably going to be a little bit better suited specifically to having cameras being used with them. Whereas I'm just using a normal rectangular messenger bag. But again, depending on what sort of bag you decide to go with, if you want to make one of these for yourself, you can look for a better messenger bag or a duffel bag or whatever, and the dimensions might not really be that big of an issue. And finally, and this is something that I personally don't really care about that much, but the more professional and more expensive ones are going to look a little bit more professional and more serious whenever you're on set. So if that's something that you care about, maybe you want to consider buying one of those instead of going the DIY route. So yeah, as of right now, I really like my DIY version of this thing, but I will never flat out say that it is definitely better than the more expensive and more professional ones. However, it is still pretty good for my needs right now. I will definitely try to continue using it on more projects in the future, and I'm gonna do my best to show more footage filmed with this thing in future videos. And it honestly feels like it's gonna turn into a go-to accessory for me, so I'll hopefully be talking about it more down the line as I improve it and maybe make a second version of it. Anyways, if you've got any questions, you can drop them below, and I will see you in the next one.